Beneath more than a mile of ancient ice, there may be something waiting. Not just rock and sediment and the slow memory of a frozen continent, but something stranger, something that shouldn't be there. Ruins, perhaps, structures, the faint geometric whisper of a world that existed before the world we think we know. Now hold that thought loosely. This is not a declaration. It is a question. And questions, when asked slowly enough in the dark, have a way of opening something in the mind. Antarctica is the most remote place on Earth. The coldest, the most hostile, the least understood. 90% of our planet's fresh water is locked inside it. It is larger than Europe, and almost all of it, nearly the entire continent, lies hidden beneath ice sheets that have been building for millions of years. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the bedrock that sleeps beneath that southern darkness, and that is where the mystery begins, because people have always been drawn to the idea that history is longer than we were taught, that somewhere just out of reach, a civilization rose and fell before our own story started. The lost city beneath the ocean, the empire swallowed by the desert. The knowledge that was almost remembered and then forgotten completely. These ideas pull at something deep in us, something that suspects the official version of the past is only the chapter someone chose to show us. Tonight, we are going to follow that pull. We are going to look at the science, the genuine archaeology, the ancient maps that should not exist, and the geology that explains almost everything. Almost. We will not pretend certainty where there is none, but we will not look away from the parts that are genuinely strange. This is a journey for the curious, for the ones who fall asleep, wondering what lies beneath. Before we go further, I want to know where you are right now. What country, what city, what hour of the night? Leave it in the comments. Because this question, this mystery, belongs to all of us, wherever we are listening from. Here is something that tends to stop people mid-thought when they first encounter it. Antarctica was not always cold. It sounds wrong. It sounds like the kind of thing someone says before revealing a trick. But the geology is unambiguous, and it is one of the most quietly astonishing facts in all of Earth's long biography. The continent sitting at the bottom of the world, buried under ice 2 miles thick in places, was once warm. Not warm the way a winter afternoon is warm. Warm in the way of ferns and forests and slow rivers running through green valleys under a sun that actually reached the ground. Go back far enough, and Antarctica was part of something larger. A supercontinent called Gondwana, which held together the landmasses that would eventually become South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica itself, all pressed against one another in a slow continental embrace. This was not recent. We're talking about a world that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, in the Jurassic and earlier, when dinosaurs moved through what is now the South Pole, and the concept of ice at the bottom of the world would have made no sense at all. Scientists have found fossils of ancient forests in Antarctica, fossilized wood, fern imprints in stone, the remains of creatures that needed warmth and standing water, and seasons with actual growth in them. The evidence is there, locked inside the rock beneath the ice, telling a story of a continent that once breathed like the rest of the living world. Then things changed, the way things on this planet tend to, slowly and completely. Around 100 million years ago, the great landmass of Gondwana began to break apart. Plate tectonics, that invisible engine grinding beneath everything, started pulling the continents away from each other. Antarctica drifted south, not quickly. Nothing in geology is quick, but with the kind of patient inevitability that makes human history look like a single afternoon. Over tens of millions of years, it moved toward the pole it now occupies. And then something else happened, something that sealed Antarctica's fate in a way that simple cold never could have done alone. Around 34 million years ago, as South America and Australia both finally separated from Antarctica and drifted away, a channel opened in the Southern Ocean, the Drake Passage between Antarctica and the tip of South America, and through that gap, something remarkable and terrible began to circulate. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a ring of ocean current that flows continuously around the continent with nothing to stop it, no landmass to interrupt it, no shelf to slow it down. Just water moving in an endless loop. And what that current does, what it has done for tens of millions of years, is isolate Antarctica. It cuts the continent off from the warmer ocean waters that flow towards it from the tropics. It acts like a wall that no warmth can easily cross. Once that current established itself, Antarctica began to freeze in earnest. The ice sheets grew, the forests vanished, the rivers stopped. By about 15 million years ago, the continent we know, the white one, the silent one, was recognizable, and it has been cold ever since, with variations with periods of slightly more or less ice, but never anything close to the green world it once was. Now, here is where this becomes relevant to the question we are quietly circling. When we talk about the possibility of ancient human civilization in Antarctica, the geology matters. It matters enormously, because modern humans, our species, emerged somewhere between 300 and 400,000 years ago. The earliest evidence of anything resembling complex society, agriculture, settled life goes back perhaps 12,000 years, and Antarctica has been deeply, hostilely frozen for millions of years before any of that. In its current state, the continent is almost entirely impossible for human habitation. Temperatures drop to negative 90 degrees Celsius in winter. The interior receives almost no precipitation, but paradoxically qualifies as a desert. There is no food chain that could sustain a settled population. But, and this is the part worth holding, there are periods in Earth's climate history that were slightly warmer. Interglacial periods, the pauses between ice ages, when ice sheets retreated somewhat, when coastlines changed, when conditions at the edges of places like Antarctica were less extreme than today. The last such period peaked around 120,000 years ago. Another, the one that ended and gave way to the last glacial maximum, had its warmth around 10 to 12,000 years ago, right at the edge of what we think of as the beginning of human history. Could the coastal margins of Antarctica, not the deep interior, but the edges, the fjords, the ice-free zones, have been habitable, barely, briefly, under different conditions? The mainstream answer is almost certainly not. The ice was still there. The cold was still there. But the question, like the current, keeps moving. So let us begin with what we actually know. Not what we suspect, not what we hope, not what would make for a more interesting story. What the evidence, carefully gathered and carefully tested, actually shows. Modern humans, the species looking up at the night sky and wondering about it, emerged in Africa somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago. For most of that time, we were doing what animals do, moving through landscapes, following food, responding to seasons and drought, and the slow pressure of other groups moving in from adjacent territories. The evidence for this long early period is fragmentary but consistent. Stone tools, scattered bones, the occasional hearth that survived in a cave where conditions were right for preservation. Then something shifted. Around 70 to 80,000 years ago, humans began leaving Africa in significant numbers, crossing into the Arabian Peninsula, moving through what is now the Middle East, spreading east toward Asia, eventually reaching Australia by sea crossing somewhere around 65,000 years ago, which remains one of the most remarkable feats of early human navigation we have any evidence for. Moving north into Europe, where they encountered the Neanderthals, and eventually, by 40,000 years ago, existed where Neanderthals no longer did. This migration is not speculation. It is written in genetics and in stone, and in dated sites on nearly every continent. It is one of the better supported stories in all of science. And the earliest complex civilizations, the ones with writing and cities and organized agriculture and remembered kings, Those begin around 5 to 6,000 years ago. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, slightly later the Yellow River in China. These were not inevitable. They were the result of particular conditions in particular places. Warm river valleys with predictable flooding and fertile soil and enough population density that specialization became possible. It took almost all of human history to get there. Now hold that timeline next to what we know about Antarctica. The continent has been frozen, genuinely, deeply, continent-wide frozen, for at least 15 million years. Even during the warmer interglacial periods, when the edges may have seen slightly more tolerable conditions, the ice never retreated the way it once did in the deep past. No forests came back. No river systems opened. The interior remained exactly what it is today, a white desert colder than anything human physiology was built to survive without significant technological assistance. This creates what you might call an evidentiary gap, so large that it is less a gap and more an absence. For there to have been a civilization in Antarctica, a real civilization, with the architecture and agriculture and social organization that word implies, human beings would have needed to be in that part of the world during a window of habitability that closed millions of years before humans existed at all. And yet, the idea does not die. And the reason it does not die is worth understanding carefully, because it tells us something important about the difference between serious inquiry and wishful thinking. What would actually count as evidence? This is the question that separates a genuine historical mystery from a comfortable bedtime story. Not ancient maps that might show a coastline. Not geometric patterns visible from satellites that might be natural formation. Not myths from cultures thousands of miles away that might be referring to anything at all. Evidence, real evidence, would need to be something that could not be explained by known processes. Think about what we look for when we try to establish that any group of people occupied any place. Foundations. Not just stone, but stone arranged with intent, with the kind of deliberate geometry that geology does not produce on its own. Artifacts made from materials that do not occur naturally where they are found. Biological traces, carbon that can be dated, bones, seeds, the remnants of meals. Fire. Humans make fire, and fire leaves signatures in sediment that survive for a very long time. And here is the distinction that matters most. There is an enormous difference between prehistoric human presence and what we mean by civilization. People may have visited places without living there. Hunting parties range far from home. Small groups pushed by desperation cross remarkable distances. A handful of humans reaching the edge of a cold coast is not the same as a society with monuments and memory and the ability to pass knowledge forward through generations. Civilization requires permanence. It requires enough food surplus to free some people from daily survival. It requires communication systems that outlast individual lives. It requires the kind of accumulated knowledge that only exists when someone writes it down, or carves it, or builds it into structures meant to last. The extraordinary claim here is not that a few people once stood on the edge of Antarctica. That would be remarkable, but not civilization-ending for our understanding of history. The extraordinary claim is that something organized, something that looked like what we call a society, existed there, and that evidence of it sleeps under the ice right now, waiting. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That phrase is not an obstacle placed by cautious people trying to protect a comfortable story. It is a standard that exists because human beings are exceptionally good at seeing patterns where there are none, at connecting dots that do not belong to the same picture, at wanting the mystery to be real so much that we mistake the wanting for the finding. So we hold two things at once. We hold the genuine strangeness of the deep past, the way time makes almost anything technically possible if you arrange the numbers right. And we hold the cold demand of evidence, which does not care what we hope. The oldest traces of people point one direction. Antarctica, in every geological and biological and archaeological sense, points to silence. But silence, as you may already be discovering, is not the same as an answer. When silence refuses to give us an answer, humans do something very reliable. We start listening harder to whispers. If the ice will not speak, people turn to things that seem older than the ice. Faded charts, strange coastlines inked in another age, stories of drowned kingdoms and lands that sank beneath the sea. This is where Antarctica steps out of geology and into the realm of maps, myths, and memory. Among the objects most often brought forward in this conversation is a single piece of parchment, the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, better known as Piri Reis, this map is not ancient in the geological sense. It is barely 5 centuries old, but in the world of alternative history, it has been treated as if it were a window onto a much older knowledge. On its surface, the Piri Reis map shows what we would expect for the early 16th century. Portions of the Atlantic, the western coasts of Europe and Africa, and the newly contacted shores of the Americas. The part that captures imaginations is the landmass drawn in the far south. A curved coastline, with promontories and inlets, labelled in Ottoman Turkish. To some eyes it looks suspiciously like the northern edge of Antarctica, shown without ice. From this resemblance, a story has grown. The story goes like this. Piri Reis himself could not have known Antarctica. The continent would not be sighted by European explorers until the 19th century. Therefore, this southern coastline on his map must come from older source charts. Charts preserved from some forgotten age, perhaps even from a civilization that surveyed the world when Antarctica was still ice-free and habitable. The map becomes, in this telling, a copy of a memory that should be impossible. It is an elegant idea. It connects dots. It gives us a line of continuity between a speculative, deep past and an actual surviving artifact. It is also, when we step back, built on a sequence of assumptions. Cartographers of the age of discovery were not tracing accurate coastlines from satellite photos. They were stitching together fragments of reports, guesses, and earlier maps, many of which were wrong in different ways. Distances were misjudged. Longitudes were uncertain. Coasts were extended, truncated, or rounded to fit pre-existing ideas about how large the world should be. In Piri Reis's case, we know from his own notes on the map that he used around 20 source charts. Some were Portuguese, some were Arabic, some he said traced back to the time of Alexander the Great, though claims like that were a common boast and not a verifiable fact. His southern landmass may be an attempt to connect the known coasts of South America with an imagined southern continent, something many European and Islamic geographers already believed existed for reasons that had nothing to do with Antarctica as we know it. For centuries before Antarctica's discovery, there was an idea known as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Philosophers argued that the world must have a large landmass in the south to balance the continents in the north, like weights on a scale. Medieval maps show extravagant southern continents extending far beyond any explored territory. They were not records of observation. They were reflections of theory. Seen in this context, the southern feature on the Piri Reis map looks less like hard evidence of ancient Antarctic surveys and more like a familiar cartographic habit, filling in the blank space with what you expect to be there. Modern cartographers and historians, when they compare the Piri Reis coastline to actual satellite data of Antarctica, find significant mismatches. The scale is off. The orientation is wrong. Features that should be present are missing, and features that appear on the map do not correspond to anything on the modern coastline. With enough imagination, almost any curved shoreline can be made to resemble almost any other, especially when you already know which resemblance you're looking for. And yet, even with all this, the Piri Reis map keeps surfacing in late-night documentaries and speculative books. Because it is real, it is old, it is intriguing, It carries handwritten notes about mysterious sources. It invites questions. The Piri Reis map is not alone. Other early maps are brought into the same orbit. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which shows a large southern continent with rivers and bays. The Boache map of the 18th century, sometimes said to depict Antarctica's subglacial topography. Each of these, when examined carefully, turns out to be a composite of guesswork, ancient geographical theories, and the limited coastal data of their time. None of them demand a lost high-tech civilization to exist, but they all have just enough ambiguity to sustain the hope. The same pattern appears when we move from parchment to story. Long before the first wooden hulls scraped Antarctic ice, people were telling tales of lands that had vanished beneath the sea. The most famous of these, in Western tradition, is Atlantis. Atlantis enters history not as a myth from a temple or a folk tale whispered across generations, but as a philosophical example in the writings of Plato in the 4th century BCE. In the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he describes a powerful island civilization beyond the pillars of Heracles, west of the Mediterranean, that grows corrupt and is destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. To many scholars, this is an allegory, a moral fable about hubris and the ideal state. Plato may have drawn vague inspiration from real disasters like the eruption of Thera that affected the Bronze Age Aegean. But Atlantis, as he uses it, is a tool for thinking, not a historical report. Centuries later, when Antarctica became part of our mental map of the world, some writers began to merge these separate ideas. A great island, sunk or frozen. A land in the far south, remote and inaccessible. Perhaps, they suggested, Atlantis was not in the Atlantic at all. Perhaps it was Antarctica, remembered dimly from an age before the ice. Other traditions get pulled into this gravitational field of speculation. In Hindu texts, cycles of destruction and renewal, continents rising and sinking, cities swept away by flood. In Polynesian stories, islands that vanished after earthquakes and tsunamis. In Aboriginal Australian lore, songlines that describe shorelines now underwater, memories that appear to match post-glacial sea level rise. In each of these cases, we see something important: the human capacity to remember environmental change across deep time through story. This is where the boundary between myth and memory becomes interesting. Myths are not peer-reviewed papers. They are not GPS coordinates. They cannot tell us that a particular latitude once supported a marble city now hiding under kilometers of ice. But they can sometimes preserve echoes of real events. A volcanic eruption turned into a tale of a fire mountain that angered the gods. A sudden flood retold as a world-spanning deluge. A coastline swallowed by rising seas transformed into a story about a land of ancestors now lost beneath the water. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have found cases where stories carry recognizable traces of things that happened thousands of years ago. Legends among Pacific Northwest peoples that seem to describe glacial outburst floods. Narratives in Australia that align with the flooding of coastal plains at the end of the last ice age. The details change, the supernatural enters, but the core memory of there was land here, and then the water came, remains. So when people ask whether myths might preserve some cultural memory of a warmer Antarctica, they are touching on a genuine phenomenon, the long half-life of story. Where the leap occurs is in assuming that because memory can carry real events across centuries, every myth of a lost land must point to the same specific, extraordinary scenario. Mainstream historians and geologists tend to be more cautious. They look at Atlantis and see Plato, not polar surveys. They look at Terra Australis and see a pre-scientific idea about balance, not a forgotten expedition's logbook. They look at the Piri Reis map and see an impressive example of 16th century cartography, rich in information about how sailors and scholars were trying to piece together a rapidly expanding world but not a smoking gun. From this perspective, the maps tell us a great deal about the cultures that made them. They reveal how people imagined the unseen parts of the globe, how rumours from ships, fragments of old charts, and philosophical expectations of symmetry blended into an image of the Earth that was part observation, part wish. The myths, in turn, tell us about the anxieties and hopes of the societies that told them. Fears of punishment and flood, longing for a golden age in the distant past. Attempts to explain strange fossils on mountaintops or ruins found half buried in silt. They are cultural artifacts, not survey data. And yet, even when we strip away the more dramatic claims, something continues to pull attention back to these materials. The reason is not hard to understand. Maps are liminal objects. They sit between the known and the unknown. Every old chart is a record of what someone believed the world looked like at a particular moment, including the places they had never seen. When we look at the blank spaces they filled in, or the coastlines drawn just a little too confidently, we glimpse the human impulse to complete the picture, to smooth the edges of ignorance. Myths serve a similar function inside the mind. They map the emotional landscape of a culture, where danger lies, where hope resides, where the past feels heavy. A story about a lost land is a way of saying that something once existed, which does not exist now, and that this absence matters. So the Peary race map and its cousins remain on the table, not because they force us to accept an Antarctic civilization, but because they embody a deeper question that keeps people turning pages late at night. How much can be lost and still leave a trace? How much of the past survives, folded into objects and stories whose meanings have shifted over time? The evidence, as scientists use that word, stays stubborn. Coastline shapes do not align as neatly as enthusiasts suggest. Ice core data and plate tectonics do not cooperate with the timelines required for a human-built Antarctic metropolis. Plato's dialogues read more naturally as philosophy than as hidden geography. But intrigue does not always require proof. Sometimes it only requires a possibility that has not been absolutely ruled out, combined with artifacts and tales just ambiguous enough to bear the weight of our imaginations. In the half-light between sleep and waking, as you drift through these stories, it is possible to hold two ideas gently at once. The first, that the Peary race map, the legends of Atlantis, the southern continents on faded charts, are products of their time, explainable without invoking a forgotten super-civilization. The second, that maps and myths alike may still carry real fragments of ancient experience, distorted by retelling but not entirely erased. Neither idea confirms shining cities under the Antarctic ice, but together they explain why people keep looking southward, onto old parchment and into old stories, searching for something that history, so far, has not agreed to show. If maps and myths are the whispers, then the ice itself is the locked door. To move closer to the heart of the question, we have to turn back from ink and allegory to the physical world and ask what a continent of frozen water can hide, and for how long. To understand what the ice might be hiding, we have to understand what the ice actually is. When we picture Antarctica, many of us imagine a flat white plate, a simple lid of snow over a smooth frozen land. The reality is far stranger and far more complicated. The ice is not a blanket laid gently on top of a continent. It is a continent of ice in its own right, thousands of meters thick, heavy enough to bend the rock beneath it. Antarctica is covered by two main ice sheets, the East Antarctic ice sheet and the smaller, more changeable West Antarctic ice sheet. In places, this ice is more than 4 kilometers thick. That is not the thickness of a snowdrift. That is a vertical stack of winters, pressed together over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. Each new snowfall buries the previous one, compressing it into firn, then into dense blue ice, layer upon layer, year upon year, until it becomes a transparent, frozen archive. If you could slice that ice sideways and look at it, it would resemble the rings of a tree, only far more delicate. Fine layers, sometimes just millimeters thick, each representing a single season. Dust from ancient deserts, ash from long-forgotten volcanic eruptions, tiny bubbles of trapped air, preserving the atmosphere as it was when mammoths still walked, or when no humans existed at all. The surface looks empty. The interior is full of time. Beneath that tower of time lies something most of us never think about: the hidden face of Antarctic rock. Because the ice is so thick and so difficult to penetrate, we did not know much about what the underlying continent looked like until very recently. For a long time, maps simply showed Antarctica as a white patch with some rough guesses about mountains near the coast. What was under the centre of the ice sheets was literally a blank space. To fill in that space, scientists turned to instruments that could see through ice. Radar, carried on planes or dragged behind tractors, sends pulses downward, which bounce off boundaries inside the ice and off the rock below. Satellite missions measure minute changes in gravity, revealing whether dense mountains or lighter sedimentary basins lie hidden beneath. Over decades, as this data accumulated, a new ghostly map emerged. Under the ice, Antarctica is not flat at all. It is a complex, rugged landscape. There are mountain ranges as high as the Alps, their peaks buried under sheets of ice. One of them, the Gamburtsev Mountains in East Antarctica, is so completely entombed that not a single rock sticks out into the air. For millions of years, this entire range has been sealed away, invisible to the sky. There are deep valleys carved long ago by flowing water and earlier glaciers now frozen in place. There are basins where the bedrock lies below sea level, making parts of West Antarctica especially unstable in a warming world, because ocean water can creep under the ice, and there are lakes, hundreds of them. These are not lakes in the sense we usually mean, with open water reflecting clouds and birds dipping to the surface. They are bodies of liquid water trapped under the ice, kept from freezing solid by the heat of the earth below and the crushing pressure above. The most famous, Lake Vostok, lies beneath nearly 4 kilometres of ice and is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. Its water may have been isolated for millions of years in perpetual darkness. Around these large lakes are networks of smaller pockets of water and thin channels, where meltwater flows slowly beneath the ice sheet, reshaping the base of the glacier, lubricating its movement toward the sea. In some places, the ground beneath the ice is not hard rock at all, but ancient, buried sediments and soils from a time when Antarctica's climate was warmer and wetter. Taken together, this means that Antarctica is not a single frozen slab. It is a layered world: sky, then snow, then compressed ice, then hidden rivers and lakes, then mountains, valleys, and plateaus. It is less like a tabletop and more like a many-storied house, with whole floors we can barely glimpse. Into this layered world, humans have drilled, flown, and listened. Ice cores, extracted by drilling straight down into the ice sheet, bring up cylinders of frozen history. By studying their chemistry, scientists reconstruct past temperatures, snowfall rates, and the composition of the atmosphere. These cores have told us, with quiet precision, how ice ages waxed and waned, how greenhouse gases rose and fell, how volcanic eruptions left traces even in the remotest place on Earth. They also tell us something else: how long ice has been present in a given place without melting away. Radar and satellite data extend this view sideways. Where the radar signal changes, we infer a boundary: ice over rock, ice over water, ice over older ice. By flying long parallel tracks, then crossing them at right angles, researchers can gradually assemble a three-dimensional picture of what the ice sits upon. It is like taking an ultrasound of a sleeping giant, building up a view of bones and organs from blurry overlapping slices. These techniques reveal features that, when viewed through a certain lens, inevitably catch the human imagination. A smooth, dome-like hill under the ice, a long, straight line on a radar image that looks at first glance like a wall, a circular depression that could, if you are inclined that way, be a crater or a buried city or a colossal temple plan. At the boundary between ice and rock, where radar echoes can be messy, shapes blur and sharpen with the slightest change in angle or processing. Most of the time, to the people who work with these data every day, such shapes are what they expect to see. Subglacial hills formed by erosion, linear ridges shaped by ancient ice flow, circular basins carved by bedrock weakness or old natural impacts. But to someone outside that field, encountering a cleaned-up image online or in a documentary, these same shapes can look uncannily like something intentional. This is where speculation begins to slip in through the cracks. We are pattern-seeking creatures. Our brains are tuned to recognize structure in chaos, sometimes find faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, order in random noise. When we see a regular angle or a smooth curve in an environment we think of as wild, we tend to ask, who made that? Under the Antarctic ice, the temptation to ask that question is amplified by the very inaccessibility of the landscape. We cannot simply go and look at that radar wall to see whether it is really a cliff of ancient volcanic rock or the remains of some lost architecture. We cannot hike over to that subglacial hill and pick up a stone from its surface. The more unreachable a feature is, the more it can be made to carry the weight of our hopes and fears. For archaeologists, though, the difference between a ruin and a rock is not just a matter of shape. Human-built structures have signatures that go beyond geometry. They show patterns of repetition, organization, and association. Settlements occur in particular kinds of places, near water, on defensible ground, along routes that make sense for movement and trade. Artifacts accompany them. Tools, pottery, modified bones, waste, even thousands of years after abandonment, even when the walls have fallen, traces of human activity can linger in the soil chemistry, in pollen records, in the distribution of tiny charcoal fragments. When we look at Antarctica through the tools we have, we do see patterns, but those patterns align more closely with processes we know from geology and glaciology than with the fingerprints of cities and roads. Subglacial mountain ranges line up with tectonic structures we recognize from other continents. Valleys match the flow paths of long-vanished rivers. Lakes sit in basins formed by rifting and erosion. Where ice moves faster, radar reveals streamlined hills and ridges, shaped as the glacier scrapes its bed. These are the landforms of a planet at work on itself, not obviously of people at work upon a planet. This does not mean it is impossible for small traces of past human presence to exist in some corner of Antarctica. There are stretches of the continent where ice has advanced and retreated multiple times over millions of years. There are coastal areas that were once ice-free and might have been habitable for hardy groups during brief windows in deep time. If anyone had ever lived there, though, their remains would be subject to the harshest possible test. The practical limits of looking for such traces under ice, several kilometers thick, are severe. Drilling a single deep ice core can take years of planning and logistics and produce a narrow vertical sample, perhaps 10 centimeters wide. Even these projects push the edge of what is currently possible. Specialized rigs, fuel depots laid out across the ice, teams of people working in sub-zero temperatures for whole seasons. To reach the rock below, rather than stopping in the ice, is harder still. Only a handful of projects have ever done it, and usually not to hunt for archaeology, but to study ancient climate or the geology of the continent. Remote sensing, for all its power, also has limits. Radar wavelengths that penetrate ice do not have the fine resolution of a camera. They smear small details together. A wall a few meters thick, buried under several kilometers of ice, would be essentially invisible at the scales we are currently working with. Satellites that map gravity and elevation can tell us about structures hundreds or thousands of meters across, not the foundations of a single building. Even if we identified a suspiciously regular shape at the base of the ice, turning that suspicion into certainty would be a monumental task. It would likely require years of international cooperation, heavy equipment flown or dragged into one of the harshest environments on Earth, and all to dig into a single point, in a continent the size of the United States and Mexico combined. For comparison, many of the most famous archaeological discoveries in more temperate parts of the world were found almost by accident, during road building, farming, or casual exploration. Antarctica offers none of those accidental glimpses. Almost nothing disturbs its surface. Time is another obstacle. Ice sheets flow. They grind against the bedrock, eroding it. Over hundreds of thousands of years, even hard stone can be scoured away. Any structure that somehow predated the onset of large-scale glaciation would, in most places, have been crushed, transported, and ground to sediment. To imagine monumental architecture surviving intact beneath the thickest parts of the ice for tens of millions of years is to ask it to endure forces capable of reshaping mountains. So when we talk about what the ice can hide, we are looking at a narrow window, short-lived features near the edges, young deposits along the coasts, perhaps landscapes briefly exposed between advances of ice, then reburied. The ice is very good at preserving things it entombs gently and leaves untouched. Microscopic bubbles of air, fragile layers of volcanic ash, bacteria sealed in the dark. It is less forgiving of anything that stands in the way of its slow, relentless flow. Still, even within these constraints, the idea of hidden landscapes under Antarctica is not purely speculative. They are real. We have mapped river systems that no human eye has ever seen, traced valley networks that last carried open water millions of years ago. In some places, sediment cores brought up from beneath the ice contain pollen and plant remains, evidence that parts of Antarctica were once green, forested, and teeming with life. When enthusiasts imagine ruins beneath the ice, they are building on a genuine foundation. The knowledge that the Antarctica we see today is only one version of this land. There have been others in other climates, forests where there is now emptiness, lakes under open sky instead of under 4 kilometers of frozen glass. Science shows us that the ice is not a simple lid, but a dynamic, sculpting force draped over an ancient, intricate terrain. It reveals the hidden flaws of that frozen house, even if we can only peek through narrow cracks. Whether those flaws ever hosted more than wind, water, and the slow work of geology is another question. To approach that question, we have to leave the technical details of ice and rock and return to the human story, and ask what it would really mean if anyone had lived there in an Antarctica warmer than ours, and why the traces of such a life would be so hard to find. When people try to answer that question, they often start with pictures. Over the last few decades, a small gallery of Antarctic images has done the rounds on television specials, in late-night forums, and on video channels promising revelations. A pyramid-shaped mountain on the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, its sides looking strangely even. A dark, straight line etched across a snowfield, suggested to be a wall or a buried roadway. Satellite photos of circular depressions or star-shaped ridges, shared with captions hinting at domes, fortresses, or colossal, eroded statues. Each image is a tiny window into an enormous, unfamiliar landscape. Each seems to offer a hint that perhaps, under all that ice, something deliberate waits. One of the most cited examples is that so-called Antarctic pyramid. From one particular angle, under the low, slanting light of polar summer, it appears almost architectural, 4 apparent faces converging to a neat point, snow lying in smooth plains, shadows carving crisp, triangular shapes. Screenshots of this mountain are often cropped tightly, isolating it from the rest of the range, emphasizing its symmetry, encouraging the eye to see design where geology sees structure. But if you pull back even slightly, a different picture emerges. Geologists explain that what we are looking at is a nunatak, a peak that sticks up through the ice, shaped by freeze-thaw and glacial erosion. In many mountain ranges, from the Alps to Patagonia, repeated cycles of frost shattering rock and glaciers grinding away loose material produce sharp, angular peaks. When 3 or more glacial valleys cut into a mountain from different directions, the result can be a form called a horn, with multiple steep faces meeting at a point. The famous Matterhorn in Switzerland is one such horn. No one suggests it is a man-made pyramid. In Antarctica, the same processes are at work. Under the right light, the natural geometry of a horn can resemble a human structure, just as a cliff can, for an instant, look like a castle. Lighting in polar regions is particularly deceptive. For much of the year, the sun skims low along the horizon, casting long shadows that exaggerate relief. A small ridge can throw a deep, dark line across a smooth expanse of snow. A gently undulating slope can appear in stark shadow, like the sharp edge of a carved terrace. Photographs taken near sunrise or sunset, or in the dim bluish light of an Antarctic summer night, flatten some features and sharpen others. To an eye already primed to look for meaning, a natural crack becomes a doorway. A snow-filled gully becomes a straight, level causeway. Perspective plays its own tricks. Satellite images are often taken at an angle rather than directly overhead, especially at high latitudes where orbital paths converge. That means vertical cliffs can be stretched, foreshortened, or merged with the slopes below them. If you tilt your head, crop the image, or rotate it, what was once clearly a cliff face becomes a mysterious, linear construction. The scale is rarely obvious. A faint streak that appears to be a narrow wall might, in reality, be a ridge kilometres long, far too massive to be any plausible piece of architecture, ancient or otherwise. Erosion, too, has a way of organising chaos into shapes that look uncannily regular. Sheets of ice scrape along bedrock, plucking and smoothing surface layers, leaving behind elongated hills that are blunt at one end and tapered at the other. In glacial geology, these are known as drumlins or streamlined forms. Fields of them can look, in plan view, like rows of engineered embankments. Wind scours exposed rock, polishing some surfaces, undercutting others, creating overhangs and recesses that mimic doorways and alcoves. When snow drifts against these forms, and then partially melts, it can leave sharp edges, clean lines, and strange planar faces that feel, at a glance, too neat to be random. Online, stripped of context, these images take on lives of their own. A researcher might post a radar cross-section in a technical paper showing a subglacial ridge as a shaded stripe. In the hands of a glaciologist, that stripe is a data point, one of thousands, that collectively map the bed. Cropped and reposted elsewhere, however, it becomes evidence of an ancient wall. Captions are added, then repeated. References to the original scale or coordinates fall away. So does the accompanying note that similar features have been documented under other ice sheets and are well understood as products of ice flow. There have been cases where a single photograph taken through the scratched window of a research plane has spawned elaborate narratives. A faint, curved shadow far below, following the contour of a snowfield, is labelled a buried dome. Commenters estimate its radius, calculate the internal volume of this imagined structure, and speculate about who might have built it and why. In reality, the original flight log, if consulted, notes that the aircraft was passing over a pressure ridge, where ice pushing against ice creates buckles and arches. The shadow's curve is simply the arc of a distorted surface, catching the light in one particular way. In these speculative chains, the initial step is almost always the same. See something unusual, assume intention. This is not a foolish impulse. For most of our history, noticing patterns has been a survival skill. Spotting the straight line of a spear in the grass or the regular outline of a shelter against the sky could mean the difference between safety and danger. Our minds are wired to err on the side of detecting agency. In a modern, image-saturated world, that wiring can misfire. turning ordinary geology into supposed ruins. To move from suggestion to science, though, archaeologists and geologists follow a different path. If someone claims that a visible feature in Antarctica is a buried structure, the first questions are basic. What is the scale? How high, how wide, how long? What is its context? Does it sit alone or in a network of related forms? Is it located on bedrock, on sediment, on a former shoreline? Does it align with known tectonic features, glacial flow lines, or patterns of erosion? Next comes comparison. Are there similar shapes in places where we know no human structures exist? Under the Greenland ice sheet, for example, or beneath parts of the Canadian Shield? Are there equivalent landforms, exposed above ice in mountain ranges, that have never hosted cities? If the feature can be matched to a known class of natural formation, the burden of proof shifts heavily toward geology. If, after this filtering, something still appears anomalous, the methods become more focused. High-resolution satellite imagery can be tasked over the area, capturing multiple views under different lighting and at different times of year. Airborne radar and laser altimetry can refine the shape of the surface and the bed below. Ground-penetrating radar, if a field campaign is feasible, can reveal internal layering. A natural hill shows uninterrupted, coherent strata. A structure filled with debris might show chaotic reflections, voids, or sharp internal boundaries. Only in the rarest and most compelling cases would anyone propose physically drilling or excavating. Such a project would involve multiple disciplines: glaciologists to understand the ice, engineers to design the access, archaeologists to plan for what to do if anything cultural were actually found. They would look not just for walls or rooms, but for the subtler marks of human presence, concentrations of charcoal, unusual ratios of certain isotopes in the soil, micro-artifacts like stone flakes or worked bone, altered layers of sediment indicating long-term occupation. Underlying all of this is a sober appreciation of what can and cannot survive immense stretches of time. Stone is durable, but not invulnerable. Hard crystalline rocks, granite, basalt, can endure for hundreds of millions of years as part of mountain ranges, but if sculpted into freestanding towers or finely carved facades, they are much more vulnerable to frost cracking, landslides, and the grinding action of ice. Softer stones, bricks made from mud or sand, and unavoided clay degrade far more quickly, especially under cycles of freezing and thawing. Metals corrode. Even bronze, resilient in some environments, can crumble in others. Iron rusts, swells, and flakes away. In a coastal Antarctic setting, with salt, wind, and occasional liquid water, metal artifacts, left for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, would likely fare poorly unless rapidly buried and stabilized. Organic materials, wood, cloth, leather, can be exquisitely preserved in cold, dry conditions, as we know from some polar expeditions and high-altitude burials. But they, too, rely on gentle treatment. The slow conveyor belt of an ice sheet, with its immense weight and constant grinding motion, is not gentle. On very long timescales, what tends to remain of a human presence are not intact structures, but traces, modified landscapes, quarries, cut terraces on hillsides, mounds where debris accumulated, subtle chemical signatures in sediments. Even in parts of the world that have been relatively stable and ice-free, finding evidence of very ancient human activity requires careful excavation and detailed analysis. In Antarctica, with its moving ice and sparse windows of exposed land, the challenge is multiplied. This is why scientists draw a sharp line between a visual anomaly and a verified discovery. A photograph of a pyramid-like peak is intriguing. A radar echo that looks, on a screen, like a straight edge is intriguing. But intrigue is not, in itself, evidence. Evidence accumulates. It is repeatable, cross-checked, and consistent across different methods. A real buried city even if heavily eroded, would likely generate multiple signals: unusual patterns in the bedrock topography, unexpected materials in sediment cores, chemical anomalies in meltwater, an arrangement of forms that resist straightforward geological explanation. So far, the most famous Antarctic ruins have not survived this kind of scrutiny. When geologists map the supposed pyramids, they fit comfortably into the known story of mountain building and glacial sculpting. The walls resolve into crevasse fields, moraines, or image artifacts. The circular domes are pressure ridges or wind-shaped snowforms. The landscape continues to speak the language of plate tectonics and ice, not of bricks and mortar. None of this eliminates the allure. Part of the power of Antarctica, in our imagination, comes from exactly this gap between what we think we see and what we can actually prove. In that space, legends grow. For those who long for a hidden chapter of human history, a grainy image or a vague line on a map can be enough to build stories upon. Yet if we are genuinely interested in what a forgotten civilization in Antarctica would imply, about climate, about migration, about the resilience and fragility of cultures, we have to hold on to the difference between possibility and proof. The ice may conceal more than we currently know. It almost certainly does. But until we find the unmistakable fingerprints of human hands, tools, altered soils, patterns of settlement, the shapes we glimpse at a distance remain, for now, features of a restless planet rather than the ruins of a lost people. And still the question lingers, softer now, quieter, drifting with the snow. If despite all these obstacles, someone had once called this continent home, what would their world have looked like, and how would their story intersect with ours? To begin answering that, we have to set aside, for a moment, the Antarctica we know, a high white desert of ice and wind. We have to rewind the planet. Antarctica has not always worn this frozen mask. For much of its deep past it sat farther north, joined to other land masses, wrapped in temperate forests, and crossed by rivers. Even after it settled over the South Pole, the climate did not flip from green to white in a single instant. Cooling took time. Ice grew in pulses. There were windows, some short, some possibly longer, when parts of the continent, or at least its fringes, were less hostile than they are today. If a civilization were ever to arise in or near what is now Antarctica, it would need one of those windows, a span of thousands of years when temperatures stayed mild enough to support plants, animals, and crucially, fresh water not locked away as ice. It would need coastlines, because throughout human history, most dense, complex societies grow along shores and river mouths, where food can be fished, trade can flow, and transport is easier than overland. Geologists can sketch versions of such coastlines. When ice sheets shrink, sea level rises worldwide. When ice grows, the seas fall, bearing shelves and widening continents. During some warmer periods in the distant past, Antarctica's ice may have retreated far inland, leaving broad low-lying plains around the edges of the continent. During colder but still unsettled times, lower sea levels elsewhere might have exposed chains of stepping stone islands between Antarctica and southern South America, or between Antarctica and what is now Australia. In these reconstructions we can trace ghostly shorelines across what are now submerged continental shelves. They are not detailed maps of harbours and bays, but they hint at where in another age river deltas might have sprawled into the sea, where sheltered inlets might have offered refuge from storms. If human or human-like beings were present anywhere in the high southern latitudes during such a period, these would be the most plausible places for a settled life to take root. Resources would shape that life. Even in a milder Antarctica, this would not be a lush tropical world. Think instead of cool maritime climates, something like the coasts of modern Patagonia, Iceland or southern New Zealand. Short summers, long winters, strong winds, forests of hardy trees and shrubs, rich marine life offshore, fish, seals, perhaps whales following ancient familiar routes. On land, Grazing animals adapted to cold and seasonal light. Rivers bringing down silt, carving valleys, leaving pockets of fertile soil. In such a setting, a people with seafaring skills, able to build sturdy boats and read the currents, might find enough to sustain permanent settlements. They might cluster along an ice-free coastal strip, using the sea as their highway, moving between sheltered coves that, in our time, lie drowned hundreds of meters below the surface, under restless waves and seasonal pack ice. Inland, they might follow river valleys only so far, wary of the higher, colder interior where glaciers lurked and weather could turn suddenly lethal. The rhythms of their year would not match those of temperate civilizations we know. At high latitudes, the sun itself becomes strange. Summers could bring long weeks of low, lingering light, never fully setting, blurring night into an extended twilight. Winters might enforce a different kind of darkness, with the sun barely lifting, if at all, above the horizon. Rituals, work and rest would likely anchor themselves not to a simple alternation of day and night, but to the slow swing of the seasons, to the advance and retreat of sea ice, to the migrations of animals and the timing of storms. For such a society to flourish, even modestly, the climate would have to remain within a relatively narrow, livable band for a long time. Generations need stability to invest in anything beyond survival. In architecture more permanent than tents, in fields that take years to improve, in knowledge carried forward and built upon. If the environment fluctuated wildly, ice advancing, then retreating, then surging forward again within the space of a few centuries, any developing complexity would be constantly battered back towards subsistence. So in imagining a forgotten Antarctic civilization, we are really imagining that somewhere in the tangled history of Earth's climate, there was a plateau of relative calm, not eternally warm, not free of hardship, but predictable enough for people to learn the coastline, map the currents, and pass that understanding on. Then the plateau would end. Earth's climate is not gentle on geological timescales. Orbital cycles slowly adjust how sunlight falls on different latitudes. Ocean currents shift as continents, drift and seaways open or close. Greenhouse gases rise and fall. In Antarctica's case, these long subtle changes eventually tipped the balance toward ice. Glaciers that once waxed and waned with the seasons might begin to linger through summer. Ice caps on high ground might start to coalesce into larger masses, their own bright surfaces reflecting more sunlight back into space, amplifying the cooling. At first this might look to people on the ground like a run of difficult years. More sea ice lingering in bays, cutting off familiar fishing spots, shorter growing seasons in sheltered valleys, rivers running colder, carrying more silt as new glaciers grind into the bedrock upstream. Perhaps elders would tell stories of when winters were easier, when the sun's warmth seemed stronger, when certain birds came in greater numbers. As ice advanced, coastlines would shift. If global sea levels fell as water became locked up in growing ice sheets, some harbours might be left high and dry, turning into muddy flats and then into tundra. Elsewhere, the crushing weight of new ice might push the land down, allowing the sea to intrude farther inland in other places. The secure, familiar margin between land and water would become a moving target. A small coastal civilization, faced with such changes, would have limited options. It might retreat, step by step, ahead of the ice, abandoning older settlements for new ones closer to open water. It might reorganize, focusing more on hunting marine mammals, less on any fragile attempts at cultivation. Or it might, as conditions worsened, splinter and disperse, some groups sailing away along uncertain routes, others trying to endure in shrinking refuges between glacier and sea. From the perspective of deep time, this kind of slow grinding crisis can erase complexity with surprising efficiency. A city abandoned, its people gone, or drastically reduced, does not stand forever as a frozen tableau. Roofs collapse, walls fall, sea storms eat away at waterfronts, earthquakes shake foundations. If on top of all that, Tens or hundreds of meters of ice advance, the process accelerates. The ice does not simply bury, it scours. It drags, grinds, and redeposits. Under such a regime, much of what we would recognize as architecture would not survive as buildings. At best, we might be left with stumps, quarried faces on bedrock cliffs, odd linear ridges of piled stone where once there were walls, patches of unnaturally mixed sediments where debris from human activity became mingled, then frozen, then smeared into new layers beneath the moving ice. If settlements were built mainly along low-lying coasts, another fate is possible. Before the ice grew to continental scale, rising or falling sea levels might have drowned these places. Houses, wharves, and pathways would be submerged on now hidden shelf plains, first colonized by marine life, then progressively buried in mud and sand. Later, when the great ice sheets spread over them, more sediment would accumulate above, sealing them away under both rock and ice, beyond the reach of any diver. Could any traces of such a people survive this sequence of drowning, grinding, and burial? In principle, yes, but not in the form of intact temples gleaming under the ice. What might endure are the stubborn, indirect signatures that archaeologists learn to read. A quarry cut into particularly hard bedrock, its regular scars surviving even after being scraped by ice. A lens of soil enriched with phosphorus and charcoal, the ghost of a long-used midden or hearth area now trapped under a moraine. A scatter of artifacts, stone tools perhaps, or worked bone, transformed into pebbles within a glacial till, their shapes blunted but their material still anomalous for their setting. The problem is not that such things could not exist. It is that, in a continent-sized landscape, with thousands of meters of ice over much of its bed, finding them becomes a problem of almost unimaginable difficulty. We are searching, essentially, for faint handwriting on a page that has been folded, torn, soaked and written over many times. Other parts of the world offer sobering parallels. Off the coasts of Europe and Asia lie drowned landscapes that were once home to people. In the North Sea, sonar has revealed the outlines of ancient river valleys and hills belonging to a lost terrain. Archaeologists call Doggerland. During the last ice age, when sea levels were lower, this was a broad plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe. People hunted there, camped there, left behind tools and bones. As the ice sheets melted and seas rose, the land sank beneath the waves. Today, fragments of that world are brought up accidentally in fishing nets and dredges. A worked antler here, a flint blade there, isolated finds hinting at communities we cannot yet see in full. Around the edges of India, in the Persian Gulf, and along parts of Southeast Asia, there are similar stories. Submerged river systems traced by marine geologists, platforms, and terraces on continental shelves that may have held early coastal settlements now inaccessible without complex underwater archaeology. None of these places hosted civilizations in the sense of grand stone cities like Thebes or Rome, but they did host people whose presence is now known mainly through a combination of indirect mapping and rare, hard-won finds. Compared to these shallower, relatively accessible shelves, Antarctica is a step further into difficulty. Its submerged margins are deeper, colder, and more heavily armoured with ice. Its onshore areas, where glacial sediments might hold reworked traces of past activity, are mostly buried under moving ice that few instruments can penetrate in fine detail. Where the bed is visible, in scattered dry valleys and nunataks, the exposed rock has often been scoured clean, leaving only the most resistant forms. So when we ask whether a forgotten Antarctic civilization could leave any trace, we are really asking whether hints could remain in a form delicate, scattered, and ambiguous enough that, even if we stumbled upon them, debates would rage over their meaning. A suspiciously organized concentration of certain minerals in a sediment core, a layer rich in soot and micro-charcoal in a place with no obvious natural fire source, a pattern in the bed topography that looks, From above, like an artificially straightened terrace, but not straight enough, not clear enough to compel consensus. All of this places the idea of an Antarctic civilization in a very particular category. It is not impossible in the way that a breathable atmosphere of oxygen on the moon is impossible. The continent has, at times, been warmer. Coastlines have shifted. Humans have shown themselves capable of reaching remote, harsh environments, given enough time and motive. The erasing power of ice and sea is real. At the same time, every step needed to build, sustain, and then conceal such a society requires a long chain of favourable circumstances. A climate window that coincides with human presence at the right latitude. Access routes by sea or land that we have not yet fully reconstructed. A cultural choice to invest heavily in places that were always at risk from returning cold. And finally, a vanishing act so thorough that so far nothing has emerged from rock, ice or ocean that clearly belongs to them. This is where the mind drifts, in that space between wakefulness and sleep, to a thin strip of land along an ancient polar sea, green only in summer, ringed by ice-streaked mountains, to smoke rising from hearths under a low circling sun, to boats pulled up on gravel beaches that now lie under dark water and grinding ice. Whether such a scene ever existed, we do not know. But the conditions under which it might have existed, the shifting climates, the fickle coastlines, the great advance of ice, are real, written into the rocks and the chemistry of the oceans. They remind us that the ground under any civilization, including our own, is less permanent than it feels, and that the silence of a place like Antarctica does not guarantee that no stories ever unfolded there. It only guarantees that, if they did, recovering them will be one of the hardest tasks we could imagine. There is a reason the mind keeps circling back to these possibilities, even when the daylight part of us knows how slim the odds are. Something in us is drawn toward the idea of lost worlds, missing chapters, things that once were and are now gone almost without a trace. It shows up in myths of sunken islands and vanished golden ages, in stories of cities swallowed by jungle or desert, in the quiet shiver that comes from looking at ruins and wondering what it felt like when they were new. Part of that attraction is simple curiosity, stretched out over deep time. We know that the world has been many different worlds before this one. Continents have traded places, seas have come and gone, forests have grown where there is now ice, and ice has advanced across what were once warm plains. Against that backdrop, the idea that human history, as we currently know it, might be only one layer among others is an alluring thought. Not necessarily because we want Atlantis with crystal towers and impossible technology, but because we sense that the story of intelligence, culture, and meaning on this planet might be richer, more entangled with climate and catastrophe than the neat timelines in textbooks suggest. We are pattern-seeking creatures, moving through landscapes whose full histories are mostly invisible to us. A faint line on a cliff, a strange shape on a sonar scan, an odd feature in a satellite image. These things tug at our imagination. Antarctica, with its immense distances and its cloak of ice, offers more blank space for the mind to project onto than almost anywhere else. It is one of the last places on Earth where, to most people, the map still feels vaguely unfinished. That remoteness matters. When a place is hard to reach, hard to see with your own eyes, it becomes easier to fill it with whatever you secretly hope or fear is there. For centuries, maps showed the far south as a suggested outline, a speculative continent drawn to balance the globe. Now we have photographs and survey lines, instead of dragons and decorative flourishes, but the psychological function is not entirely gone. The white space is still there, just in a different form. Kilometres of ice no one has drilled through yet, valleys no one has walked, stretches of seabed no one has scanned. In that white space stories thrive. Some are gentle, tales of hidden ecosystems, of strange microbial life slumbering in black lakes under the ice, of meteorites preserved in the cold. Others are more dramatic: secret bases, buried spacecraft, ancient temples preserved like insects in amber. Conspiracy theories flock to Antarctica partly because ordinary access is so restricted. When almost all of what happens on a continent takes place out of sight, handled by a small number of specialized teams, it can be easy for outsiders to imagine anything at all occurring there, from clandestine experiments to excavations kept from public view. Yet even this tendency towards conspiracy is just another expression of the same basic drive. We do not like loose ends, an unexplained feature, a gap in the record, a region we barely understand. It all invites narratives that connect the dots, that turn scattered data into a coherent, emotionally satisfying picture. A hidden civilization, older than anything we know, fits that need very well. It tells us that there is more to the world than the everyday, and that some secrets are grand rather than mundane. Underneath, though, there is a tension. On one side is the mythic impulse, the comfort of a story with clear shapes and dramatic turns, where a lost people flourished on green Antarctic shores and then vanished under ice. On the other side is the slow, methodical work of science, which moves in smaller steps and hesitates to leap beyond what the evidence can bear. Scientific caution can seem, at first glance, like a dampening force, forever saying, not yet, not enough, we can't be sure. Myth, by contrast, is willing to say, this is how it was, even when that certainty rests on little more than wishful thinking and repetition. That friction can make careful explanations feel unsatisfying. If a satellite picks up a curious straight line under the ice, or an old map hints at a coastline we cannot account for, the patient answer that there are many ways for such things to arise, most of them prosaic, seems to lack the emotional weight of a buried city. Yet this restraint is not a refusal of wonder, it is a different way of honouring it. To say we don't know yet is to leave the door open for future discovery, rather than slamming it shut with the first dramatic theory that appears. Unanswered questions are not by themselves evidence for any particular answer. A gap in our knowledge does not lean automatically in the direction of the most spectacular possibility. The fact that we have not drilled through every ice stream, mapped every valley, or sampled every layer of Antarctic sediment does not, on its own, make an ancient civilization likely. It simply means we are still ignorant about many details of the continent's past. Ignorance is an opening, but it is not a vote. This can feel unsatisfying in the quiet hours when a drifting mind wants resolution. The temptation is to treat mystery as a kind of vacuum that demands to be filled, and to treat the most elaborate theory as the one most worthy of that space. But much of the beauty of a place like Antarctica lies in letting the questions hang, without rushing to anchor them to a single, fixed story. The reality is already strange enough that it does not need additional embroidery to be compelling. Consider what Antarctic science is actually uncovering. Beneath the ice sheet, there are entire river systems flowing in darkness, carving channels, feeding subglacial lakes sealed off for perhaps millions of years. There are sediments that hold the chemical memory of ancient atmospheres, tiny trapped bubbles recounting climates that came and went long before humans learned to write. There are fossils of temperate forests that once grew there, leaves and wood from trees that basked in a sun that circled low but did not bring killing cold. There are traces of vanished mountain ranges, crushed and buried, and evidence of times when the ice almost collapsed entirely, letting the sea lap at bedrock, now hidden under kilometres of frozen water. Each ice core pulled up from the depths is a kind of vertical timeline, carrying within it the echo of volcanic eruptions, the breath of prehistoric seasons, the fingerprints of past greenhouse gas surges and declines. Radar surveys reveal landscapes sculpted in darkness, with valleys and ridges that have not seen open air for millions of years. The very fact that such a vast dynamic system can exist mostly out of human sight is, in its own way, as uncanny as any legend. Even within recorded human history, Antarctica has been a stage for stories that skirt the edge between myth and fact. For generations, people believed in a great southern continent without ever laying eyes on it. Later, explorers pushed into the ice, risking scurvy, starvation, and madness, driven by a mix of glory-seeking, scientific curiosity, and something harder to name, the pull of a horizon that refuses to settle. Their journals describe mirages, great walls of ice, illusions of land where there was only sea fog. The line between what was actually there and what the mind conjured in the cold often blurred. Against this backdrop, the possibility of deeper, older human stories at the pole is just one more layer of potential meaning. It may remain entirely speculative. No clear ruins may ever emerge from under the ice, no unmistakable tools from beneath a moraine, no carvings on a rock face that can be dated to some impossibly ancient polar culture. If that is how it unfolds, the loss is not as great as it might seem, because the continent is already telling us something vast about change, fragility, and time. The endurance of the Antarctic mystery, then, is not only about whether a forgotten civilization once lived there. It is about what this frozen continent symbolizes, a boundary between the known and the unknown, between the mapped and the imagined. As long as there are questions we cannot yet answer about how fast ice can melt, how ecosystems cope with darkness, how climates tip from one state to another, Antarctica will remain a kind of mirror for our deepest fascinations and fears. We are, in a sense, always standing at the edge of its whiteness, peering in, the scientist with instruments and models, and the storyteller with myths of lost ages are not as far apart as they might appear. Both are responding to the same silence, the same stretch of the world that resists easy understanding. One answers with measurements, the other with narrative. Both are attempts to bridge the gap between what we can see and what we wonder about. Allowing the mystery to endure does not mean indulging every extravagant claim. It means acknowledging that not knowing is a real state, not a flaw to be plastered over with whichever theory feels most satisfying in the moment. It means respecting the difference between what is possible, what is plausible, and what is supported by evidence, and still finding room within that careful structure for awe. So as you drift, you can hold both thoughts at once. On one hand, the likelihood that a grand, forgotten civilization lies intact beneath Antarctic ice is, as far as we can tell, very small, hemmed in by the harsh logic of geology, climate, and archaeology. On the other hand, the continent is unquestionably holding stories we have not yet learned to read, stories of forests that rustled in polar twilight, of seas that rose and fell, of ice sheets that thinned to the brink and then returned. In that space between what might have been and what we can prove, the imagination finds room to wander, softly, not to assert, not to insist, but simply to picture and then let the image fade. The mystery endures not because it hides definitive answers waiting to be uncovered, but because it reminds us how young our understanding is, how much of Earth's long memory lies outside our direct reach. And that, in a quiet way, can be enough. To know that at the southern end of the world, there is a vast cold archive, still turning slowly under the stars, holding within it more than we have yet learned to ask. As we pull back from that archive in our minds, it helps to lay everything out, gently, like artifacts on a table. On one side, the strongest pieces of evidence we actually have, the ice cores with their layered climates, the fossils of long-vanished forests, the buried river systems, and lakes that show how alive the hidden landscape still is. We have seas that once washed higher and lower than today, coastlines that shifted, and clear signs that Antarctica was in warmer ages a place where complex life could flourish. On another side, we have what is missing. No firmly dated tools or structures older than known polar expeditions. No carvings in exposed rock that demand a human hand from some remote, forgotten age. No layers of ash or debris that shout of cities erased overnight. If there were people in Antarctica before the ice, or on the fringes as it advanced, their traces, if they exist at all, have not yet stepped out from the background noise of stone and sediment. Between those two sides lies the wide field of possibility. It is not impossible that small groups of humans once skirted a greener Antarctic shore, or that a coastal culture, fragile and low-lying, left only a few scattered remnants, now submerged or ground away. It is not impossible that future technology will pull from the ice a pattern we do not yet recognize as cultural, or that a canyon wall will emerge from retreating glaciers bearing marks that force us to rethink the timeline. But for now, these remain possibilities, not conclusions. The idea of a civilization older than Atlantis, entombed beneath the southern ice, is a story that lives precisely because the evidence neither confirms nor fully forbids it. It is speculative, delicate, and best held lightly, a thought experiment that lets us feel the scale of deep time, the power of climate, and the smallness of our current knowledge. If anything, the real lesson of Antarctica may be less about lost cities and more about humility, about remembering that, even in an age of satellites and sensors, whole landscapes can remain effectively unseen. Whole chapters of Earth's story can lie folded under a smooth white surface. The continent asks us to be patient, to accept that some answers will come slowly, and that some may never resolve at all. So as you listen, you can let the more extravagant visions drift to the edges, like dreams that dissolve with the morning, and hold instead to the quieter wonder. Somewhere far to the south, wind is moving over ice that has not melted in hundreds of thousands of years. Snow is falling on places no one has stood. Beneath that snow, and the ice below it, mountains sleep in the dark. Rivers wind their hidden courses, and whatever traces of past worlds remain are pressed into silence. For now, Antarctica keeps its own counsel. It turns under the stars, vast and mostly unheard, storing its secrets in cold and pressure. One day, we may read more of what is written there, or we may simply go on, imagining, filling the long polar night with stories that help us feel our way through the unknown. If you've enjoyed wandering through these possibilities, you're welcome to gently support this journey by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. Tell me what you think might be hidden under the ice, or simply where in the world you're listening from tonight. Then let the questions soften, the images fade, and let Antarctica recede again into the dark, carrying its mysteries beneath the snow.